It can be pretty difficult to decide which paints to use for a painting. But what if you have to decide between a cheap or expensive paint from the same brand? In this video, I'm going to compare Blick Studio paint with Blick Professional paint. And this is the first time I'm comparing a cheap versus expensive paint that's from the same brand. Usually whenever I do a paint comparison video, I make two different paintings. But this time, instead of working on two different canvases, I'll be working on this sketch of Two-Face. For the normal face, I'll be using Blick's cheaper paint, which is the Studio Acrylics, and for the right side, I'll be using the more expensive Acrylics. When sketching out Two-Face, I really wanted to go for the 90s cartoon Batman version of Two-Face. Whenever I think of Two-Face, this is typically the version I think of. I already have my sketch, so I can bring this into Procreate. I can go over all of my lines, fix any issues, and I can play with different colors that I can use in this painting. Once I'm done in Procreate, I can prep the background of this canvas. And since the primary color is going to be blue, a really good complementary color for the background is going to be magenta. So I'll put a few layers, then wait for it to dry. Now I can transfer my sketch of Two-Face onto the canvas. After I'm done transferring, I like to use Posca markers to go back over my graphite lines. If I don't, then I could smudge or rub the graphite off of the canvas while painting, and also these white lines are more visible on camera. That way you can see what I'm working on in the video. After all the sketching, transferring, and prepping, I can get started painting, and we're going to start with the more expensive Blick paint on the monstrous side of Two-Face. Right away, I can't tell that I'm working with a more expensive paint. That doesn't mean that this is a bad paint, it's just that most of the time I don't notice the quality as soon as I get started. But after painting for a few minutes, I do notice this paint has a really good opacity to be able to cover the dark magenta as well as it is. This paint from Blick's also blending really well. I'm able to create different levels of shading and highlights pretty easily while painting. And I'm able to use some of my favorite blending techniques with very little effort. And even though this monstrous side of Two-Face is primarily blue, I do have a color-rich palette to work with. Dark blues, light blues, reds, pinks, yellows, and of course black and white. So throughout the entire half of the painting, I'm able to fully test the quality of this paint. This paint is hitting all the markers that I would expect from a more expensive paint brand. The pigments are rich and vibrant, the difference in the wet and dry color is very minimal. It's really easy to blend this paint whether you use a wet on wet or a wet on dry technique. I want very little texture in this painting, and that's been very easy to achieve so far. And the opacity is really good. I only need 1 or 2 layers except for the yellow, which only needed 3 layers to cover the magenta background. Now it's time to use the Blick Studio paints for the Harvey Dent side of the face. And since I'm using 2 different paints on this project, the main goal is to have consistency in this painting. The same texture, blending, color matching. And to make it a successful painting for me, it needs to look like one cohesive art piece. Right away I can tell these paints are very different. Same brand, but a very, very different feel to these. The studio paints are making it difficult to create the texture that I'm looking for because the surface of the paint is drying very quickly and coagulating, which makes this gooping effect that results in a rough texture. That's really tricky to work with. But I figured out that if I paint in very thin layers, I can get a much smoother texture. This paint's also giving me a lot of trouble while mixing. The paint keeps drying slightly darker than I expect it to, so I'm having to mix them brighter without accidentally mixing them too bright. Which is a lot harder than it sounds because you mix the paints like you normally do and expect it to have a skin tone similar to a slight tan. But then it dries and it just looks like Harvey Dent spent too much time at the beach. So I'm having to mix the paint and then test it on my palette and see what the color is after it dries. Using the professional paints and then switching to these studio paints has been challenging, but after some trial and error and getting used to how these work, I'm able to get the consistency that I'm looking for. And once that happens, this side of the painting is coming along a lot faster. The cheaper acrylics are far more difficult to work with, so overall, the more expensive professional paints are just better. The pigments are richer, the opacity's higher, the colors blend easier on the canvas, and considering the size of the tubes, the professional paints aren't a lot more expensive. Just a few dollars more and you get a much better painting experience. And that's it, this painting is done, and even though I struggle with the cheaper paints, I think this painting turned out awesome. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check out my other videos, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.